Michael Donovan adjusted his tie in the mirrored elevator of the Donovan Technologies headquarters, the sleek black glass walls reflecting a version of himself he had perfected over the years. Confident, polished, untouchable. The elevator glided to the top floor without a sound, the way everything in his world did, from the assistants who delivered his morning espresso to the private cars that whisked him across the city. Silent, seamless, efficient. Just like him. Or so it seemed. The elevator doors opened to reveal the sprawling expanse of his office, framed by floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased San Francisco's skyline. The city glittered in the morning light, a testament to ambition and power, much like Michael himself. He had built an empire from the ground up, turning a small tech startup into a global powerhouse. At 42, he had achieved what most men could only dream of: a penthouse overlooking the bay, a fleet of luxury cars, and a bank account that only his accountants could fully comprehend. And yet, as he strode toward his desk, the weight of the day pressed against his chest. The acquisition of a smaller competitor was nearly finalized, a move that would cement his company's dominance in the industry. It was a deal worth billions, a culmination of months of strategy and negotiation. On paper, it was a triumph. But Michael didn't feel triumphant. He sank into the plush leather chair behind his desk, scanning the sea of documents his assistant, Trevor Monroe, had meticulously arranged. "The final signatures for the deal will be ready by 3, Trevor said, entering without knocking. As always, he carried an air of calm precision, his suit immaculate, his demeanor efficient. "And the cash for the optics is in the suitcase. It's in the safe now." Michael nodded, barely hearing him. The suitcase was part of a carefully orchestrated move, a dramatic gesture of handing over $100,000 in cash to symbolize his confidence in the deal. It was the kind of showmanship that thrilled investors and made headlines, but the idea of it left him cold. Trevor studied him for a moment before continuing. "You'll need to leave the office by 2 to make the meeting. Everything else is under control." "Thanks," Michael said, waving him off. He stared at the documents before him but didn't really see them. His mind wandered to the last gala he had attended, surrounded by flashing cameras and shallow conversation. His ex-fiancée, Victoria Ellis, had been there, draped in a designer gown and sharp smiles, as polished as she had been in their 3 years together. She was perfect for his image, perfect on paper. But their relationship had been a hollow transaction, like so much else in his life. Michael rubbed his temples, the city stretching endlessly beneath his window. For all the grandeur and power he had amassed, it had come with a cost. Long nights staring at an empty penthouse, deals brokered with cold efficiency, friendships reduced to partnerships. He thought of his father, a mechanic who had worked double shifts to send him to college. "Never let money own you, Mikey," he had said more times than Michael could count. But Michael hadn't really listened. Money had become everything, a measure of success, a shield against the vulnerability his father had always carried in his rough, grease-streaked hands. Michael sighed and stood, walking to the safe Trevor had mentioned. He punched in the code, and the heavy door opened with a soft click. Inside sat the black leather suitcase, a stark contrast to the sterile silver walls of the safe. $100,000 in neat bundles of $100 bills. Enough to change someone's life. To Michael, it was just a tool. He lifted the suitcase, surprised by its heft. For a moment he hesitated, staring at the weight of his wealth in his hands. What would his father think if he could see him now? Would he be proud of the empire Michael had built or disappointed by the man he had become? A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. His assistant, Janet, peeked in. "Your car is ready, Mr. Donovan." Michael nodded and strode out, the suitcase in hand. In the car, he glanced at his phone, the barrage of emails and notifications a constant reminder of the empire that never slept. He dictated a curt response to one investor, signed off on another report, and then, as if by habit, stared out the tinted window at the bustling streets of San Francisco. As they approached the meeting location, the driver pulled over to check a document Michael had handed him. Michael, distracted by another email, placed the suitcase on the curb for just a moment. The moment stretched into minutes as he scrolled through his phone, answering another urgent message and barking into his Bluetooth headset about a delayed shipment. It wasn't until the car pulled away and Michael reached for the suitcase that he realized it was gone. Panic rose in his chest like a tidal wave. "Stop the car," he barked, his voice sharp enough to startle the driver. Michael threw open the door and stepped onto the curb, scanning the street. People bustled past, oblivious to the black suitcase that had just disappeared into the chaos of the city. For a moment, Michael stood frozen, his mind racing. The suitcase represented more than cash. It was a symbol of his control, his precision, his image. And now, it was gone. A rare chill ran through him as he began to retrace his steps. The empire he had built was vast, but in this moment, it all felt precarious, as if the loss of a single suitcase could unravel the carefully constructed threads of his life. Little did he know, the path of that suitcase, and the person who would return it, would change his world in ways he couldn't begin to imagine. Avery Johnson adjusted the strap of her messenger bag, her feet aching from a 12-hour day that started with clinical rounds and ended with a nursing class in downtown Oakland. Her son Marcus had texted her earlier to remind her that his school project was due tomorrow, an intricate solar system model they'd been working on all week. She promised herself they'd finish it tonight, no matter how tired she was. Her pace quickened as she approached the corner of 14th and Broadway. The hum of the city surrounded her, honking horns, the distant wail of a siren, snippets of conversation floating from bustling food trucks. She clutched her coat tighter against the chilly evening air and tried to remember if she had enough poster board for Marcus's project. Then she saw it. The black suitcase sat unassuming against the curb, partially hidden by the shadows of a street lamp. For a second she thought someone might come back for it, a distracted commuter or a delivery driver. But as she passed, curiosity tugged at her. Who would leave something so expensive-looking just sitting there? She stopped. A small voice in her head whispered to keep walking. She didn't have time for mysteries tonight. But something stronger, the instinct her late grandmother had called God's nudge, told her to check. Avery glanced around, then knelt beside the suitcase, her fingers brushing against its cool leather. "This is crazy," she muttered under her breath, snapping the latches open. Inside, neat stacks of $100 bills stared back at her. Avery's breath hitched. There had to be at least $100,000, enough to pay for nursing school, clear Marcus's medical bills, and leave a little for savings. For a moment, the weight of her struggles, the endless shifts, the unpaid bills, the anxiety that Marcus deserved more than she could give, pressed down on her, harder than ever. She shut the suitcase quickly and stood, her pulse hammering in her ears. "It's not mine." The words echoed in her mind like a mantra. Avery was many things: a single mother, a woman stretched too thin, someone who had learned to live on scraps of time and energy. But she was not dishonest. Her grandmother's voice was clear as day. "Do the right thing, baby, even when it's hard." Avery spotted a business card lying on the ground a few feet away, likely dislodged from the suitcase. She crouched to pick it up, reading the embossed gold lettering, Michael Donovan, CEO, Donovan Technologies. A phone number and address in San Francisco were printed below. She groaned. San Francisco might as well have been a world away. She didn't have time for this, not tonight. But something about leaving it there, knowing someone else might not have the same principles, felt wrong. She closed her eyes briefly, the image of Marcus smiling at her as they painted planets filling her mind. "I'll figure this out," she said quietly, determination settling over her. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing the pristine interior of Michael Donovan's penthouse. Avery hesitated, clutching the suitcase tightly, her resolve waning under the sheer opulence surrounding her. The floor gleamed, and the walls showcased abstract art pieces she couldn't even begin to price. "What am I doing here?" she thought. She wore her scrubs and a well-worn coat, her hair pulled back into a low bun. She was painfully aware of how much she didn't belong in a place like this. Before she could turn back, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the hallway. A man appeared, taller and more imposing than she'd imagined, wearing a tailored suit that looked like it cost more than her monthly rent. His expression was one of irritation, his brow furrowed as though she were just another problem to solve. "Can I help you?" His tone was clipped, his eyes scanning her as though trying to place her. Avery swallowed hard and squared her shoulders. "I think this belongs to you." She lifted the suitcase slightly, her fingers tightening around the handle. Michael froze, his gaze shifting to the suitcase. For a moment, his polished exterior cracked, his jaw slackening. "Where did you—" "I found it on the curb," she said quickly, cutting off his question. "Your business card was nearby. I thought I should return it." Michael approached slowly, his eyes locked on the suitcase. When he took it from her hands, his fingers brushed hers briefly, just enough to make her skin prickle. He set the suitcase on a nearby table and snapped it open. Avery watched as his eyes scanned the contents, his expression a mix of relief and disbelief. "It's all here," he murmured, as if speaking more to himself than to her. "Of course it is," Avery said, folding her arms across her chest. "Why wouldn't it be?" Michael looked up sharply, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You're telling me you found this on the street and you didn't even consider keeping it?" "Not for a second," she replied, her voice firm. He studied her, the intensity of his gaze making her shift uncomfortably. "Everyone has a price," he said, leaning back against the table. "What's yours?" Her jaw tightened. "I didn't come here for a reward, Mr. Donovan. I came here because it's the right thing to do." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and unshakable. For the first time in years, Michael found himself at a loss for words. People didn't surprise him anymore. They wanted something, always. But this woman, with her tired eyes and unyielding posture, had just walked into his world and upended everything he thought he knew about human nature. "What's your name?" he asked finally. "Avery Johnson," she said, turning toward the door. "And you're welcome." Before he could respond, she was gone, leaving Michael standing alone in his opulent penthouse, the suitcase of money untouched at his side. For the first time in a long time, Michael Donovan felt something stir in him, something that wasn't pride or ambition but curiosity, and a faint, unfamiliar hope. The morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Michael Donovan's penthouse, but its warmth didn't reach him. He stood by the window, staring at the suitcase on his desk, as if it might hold more than bundles of cash. It wasn't the money that haunted him. It was her, Avery Johnson. Her name replayed in his mind as he tried to reconcile her actions with the world he knew. Who returned a suitcase with $100,000 in cash and walked away without asking for anything. He had wanted to believe there was an angle, a hidden motive. But when she turned and left, head held high, her message had been clear. She wasn't like everyone else. Michael ran a hand through his dark hair, loosening the tie he'd barely managed to knot before his morning meeting. He'd been distracted since last night, his thoughts drifting back to Avery. She had looked so out of place in his penthouse, her scrubs and tired eyes a stark contrast to the polished, expensive world he inhabited. But she hadn't seemed intimidated. Instead, she'd stood there with quiet strength, like she belonged wherever she decided to be. "Mr. Donovan?" Janet's voice interrupted his thoughts as she stepped into the room, tablet in hand. "Your car is ready for the meeting downtown. Trevor's already en route." Michael nodded, forcing himself to focus. "Thank you, Janet. I'll be down shortly." She hesitated, her brow furrowed as if debating whether to say more. "You seem preoccupied this morning." "I'm fine," he said curtly, turning back to the window. Janet knew him well enough to recognize when he didn't want to talk. But as the door clicked shut behind her, Michael sighed and shook his head. He wasn't fine. He had built his life on control, on anticipating every move, every possible outcome. Avery's honesty had thrown him completely off balance. Miles away, Avery stood in her small kitchen, sipping her first cup of coffee, and watching Marcus finish his bowl of cereal. "Mom, did you see my Saturn ring? It's crooked." Marcus held up the solar system model they'd spent the last week working on, a hint of panic in his voice. "Relax, sweetheart," she said with a gentle smile, setting her mug down. "We can fix it before school. Pass me the glue gun." He handed her the tool, his worried expression easing. Avery worked quickly, her hands steady despite the fatigue tugging at her. She had stayed up late thinking about Michael Donovan and the surreal evening she'd spent in his penthouse. "What if I kept it?" she had whispered into the quiet of her living room after Marcus had gone to bed. But even as she said the words, she knew the answer. She couldn't have kept it, not without losing a part of herself. She glanced at the clock. "All done. Now grab your backpack. We don't want to be late." Marcus grinned, carefully cradling the model in his hands. "Thanks, Mom. You're the—" Avery smiled, but her thoughts lingered on Michael. She couldn't help but wonder what someone like him, a man with a life so far removed from hers, thought of her after their brief encounter. Later that day, Michael sat in the back of his sleek black town car, his phone buzzing with notifications. The meeting downtown had gone as planned, another success to add to his list, but the satisfaction felt hollow. "Janet," he said, glancing at his assistant in the front seat, "can you find out more about Avery Johnson?" Janet turned slightly, her expression neutral. "Avery Johnson?" "The woman who returned the suitcase last night." "Of course. Do you have any specific details about her?" Michael hesitated, realizing how little he actually knew. "She said she's in nursing school, and she has a son." Janet nodded, already typing on her tablet. "I'll see what I can find." As the car wove through the city streets, Michael felt a strange mix of anticipation and guilt. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. An excuse to thank her properly? To understand what made her so different? What was it about her that made him want to know more? Avery was halfway through her shift at the free clinic when she noticed him. Michael Donovan stood in the waiting area, looking impossibly out of place in his tailored suit. His presence turned heads, whispers rippling through the room. Avery froze, her pulse quickening. He saw her almost immediately, his piercing gaze locking onto hers. She took a deep breath and walked over, determined not to let him see how unsettled she felt. "What are you doing here?" she asked, keeping her voice low. Michael held up a small paper bag. "I brought lunch." She blinked. "For who?" "For you," he said simply, his expression serious. Avery glanced around, acutely aware of the curious looks they were getting. "This isn't necessary." Michael stepped closer, lowering his voice. "It is. I owe you more than just a thank you, Avery. The least I can do is make sure you eat something today." She stared at him, her defenses faltering. There was no arrogance in his tone, no condescension, just sincerity. Finally, she sighed and gestured toward an empty bench outside. "Fine, 5 minutes, then I have to get back to work." They sat in silence for a moment as she opened the bag, revealing a neatly packed sandwich and a small bottle of water. "Do you always bring people food when you're feeling guilty?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Michael smirked. This is new for me." Avery couldn't help but laugh, the sound surprising both of them. "Well, I guess I should be flattered." "You should," he said, his tone softening. "Not many people would do what you did. You could have kept the money. No one would have known." Avery looked down at the sandwich in her hands. "I would have known." Michael studied her, his expression unreadable. For all the wealth and power he'd amassed, he realized he'd never met someone like her, someone who seemed so grounded, so certain of who they were. And for the first time in years, Michael Donovan felt something unexpected. Hope. Avery adjusted her coat as she stepped out of the free clinic and into the crisp evening air, her thoughts still lingering on Michael Donovan's unexpected visit. She wasn't sure what unsettled her more, his presence in her world or the quiet sincerity in his eyes when he'd insisted on bringing her lunch. Her life wasn't simple, but it was predictable, grounded. People like Michael didn't fit into that. They were distractions, complications, everything she didn't need. But as much as she tried to push him from her thoughts, she couldn't ignore the way he'd looked at her, as if he saw her for more than her struggles, as if he genuinely wanted to understand. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. "Hey, Mom!" Marcus's voice chirped on the other end. "Guess what? I got an A on my solar system project." Avery smiled, the tension in her shoulders easing. "That's amazing, baby. I knew all that glue and glitter would pay off. Did you thank your teacher for the extra time she gave you?" "Yep. She said it was the most creative one in the class. Mrs. Anderson even took a picture of it for the school website." Avery felt a swell of pride. Marcus was the bright spot in her life, her reason for everything. No matter how tired she was, he made it all worth it. "I'll be home soon," she said. "We can celebrate with pizza. Sound good?" "Yes, pepperoni, please." Avery laughed softly. "Pepperoni it is. Love you, sweetheart." "Love you too, Mom." As she hung up, a flicker of doubt crept in. She didn't want anything or anyone to disrupt the life she'd built for Marcus, no matter how charming or persistent they might be. Michael stood in his penthouse that night, staring out at the glittering city below. His assistant Janet had sent over a report on Avery Johnson earlier in the evening, but he hadn't opened it yet. It felt invasive, like he was prying into a life that wasn't his to dissect. Instead, he replayed their brief conversations in his mind. Her honesty, her independence, her refusal to let him place her in the same box as everyone else. It all fascinated him. She was a puzzle he couldn't solve, and for a man like Michael, that was both frustrating and thrilling. He finally sat down at his desk and opened the file Janet had sent. It was sparse. Avery was as private on paper as she was in person. He learned she was 33, a single mother, and a nursing student. Her financial struggles were evident in the details Janet had unearthed. Unpaid medical bills for her son, part-time jobs that barely covered rent, and scholarships that kept her afloat in school. Michael leaned back in his chair, feeling a pang of guilt. He had spent most of his adult life insulated from the realities of people like Avery. Money was a tool to him, a means to solve problems quickly and efficiently. But for Avery, it wasn't that simple. Her life was built on sacrifice, grit, and choices he couldn't begin to understand. The buzz of his phone interrupted his thoughts. Trevor's name lit up the screen. "Michael," Trevor began, his voice clipped. "We need to talk about the Delgado deal." Michael sighed. "Not tonight, Trevor. This isn't optional. The board is concerned about your recent distractions." Distractions. Michael bristled at the word. I'm handling the Delgado deal, he said sharply. Tell the board to focus on their own responsibilities. Trevor paused, then lowered his voice. You're the one who always said control is everything. Don't let this, whatever this is, cost you your focus. The call ended abruptly, leaving Michael staring at the screen. Trevor wasn't wrong. His life had always been about control, about precision. But Avery had shaken something loose in him, something he wasn't sure he wanted to tighten back up. The next day, Michael found himself in Oakland, standing in front of a small apartment building. It was a far cry from the luxury high-rises he was used to, but something about it felt more alive. Children played on the sidewalk, neighbors called out to each other, and the scent of fresh bread wafted from a nearby bakery. Avery answered the door after his second knock, her expression shifting from surprise to irritation in an instant. "What are you doing here?" she asked, stepping into the hallway and closing the door behind her. "I came to see you," Michael said simply. "You can't just show up at my apartment." "I didn't know how else to reach you." Her eyes narrowed. "Ever heard of a phone?" Michael smiled faintly. "Would you have answered?" Avery opened her mouth, then closed it, realizing he was probably right. "What do you want, Michael?" He hesitated, his hands shoved into his coat pockets. "I want to understand you. Why you did what you did. Why you didn't keep the money." Avery folded her arms, leaning against the wall. "I already told you, it wasn't mine." "It's more than that," Michael pressed. "People don't just do things like that. Not anymore." "Maybe people don't in your world," she shot back. "But not everyone's trying to game the system. Some of us just want to get through the day without compromising who we are." Her words hit him harder than he expected. Michael had spent so much time in a world where everything was a transaction, where people measured their worth in deals made and opportunities seized. Avery didn't fit that mold. She was something entirely different. "Let me take you to dinner," he said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. Avery blinked. "Excuse me?" "Dinner," Michael repeated. "Nothing fancy, just dinner. I want to get to know you." Avery stared at him for a long moment, the corners of her mouth twitching in what might have been a smile. "You don't give up, do you?" she asked. "Not when something's worth it," he said softly. Her gaze softened for a moment, then she straightened. "One dinner, no promises." Michael nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "That's all I'm asking." As he walked back to his car, Michael felt a strange lightness in his chest, a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Avery glanced at herself in the mirror, smoothing the creases in her simple blue dress. She hadn't worn it in years, not since Marcus's kindergarten graduation, but it still fit well enough. Her reflection stared back with a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. Dinner with Michael Donovan. What am I doing? She thought about canceling a dozen times throughout the day. Michael's world was a far cry from hers, and the last thing she wanted was to feel out of place. But something about the way he'd asked, her earnest and almost vulnerable, made her want to see where this led. Just one dinner, she told herself. Nothing more. A knock at her apartment door pulled her from her thoughts. Marcus, sitting on the couch with his favorite superhero comic, looked up with wide eyes. "Is that Mr. Michael?" he asked. "Maybe," Avery replied, forcing her voice to sound casual. "Stay here, okay? I'll be back soon." She opened the door to find Michael standing there, looking effortlessly polished in a tailored gray blazer and dark jeans. He held a small bouquet of daisies, their bright yellow centers a cheerful contrast to his otherwise formal demeanor. "For you," he said, offering the flowers with an uncertain smile. Avery blinked, caught off guard by the gesture. "You didn't have to. Thank you." She took the bouquet and stepped aside, placing it in a glass of water before grabbing her coat. Ready? Michael asked, his voice soft. As I'll ever be, she said, closing the door behind her. They walked in silence for a few minutes, the bustling noise of Oakland filling the spaces between them. Michael led her to a small Italian restaurant, tucked into a quiet corner of the neighborhood, its warm glow spilling onto the sidewalk. I figured something low-key might be better, he said as they stepped inside. Avery nodded, impressed that he'd chosen a place that felt approachable. The restaurant was cozy, with red checkered tablecloths and soft jazz playing in the background. Once seated, they scanned their menus in silence until Michael broke it. "You're nervous," he said, his eyes meeting hers. Avery set her menu down, raising an eyebrow. "You're not?" "Terrified," he admitted with a chuckle. "I'm not usually in situations like this." "Situations like what?" "On a date with someone who doesn't care about my money or my company." The word date hung in the air between them, making Avery's cheeks flush. "Is that what this is?" Michael hesitated, his confidence flickering. "I hope so. But if it's just dinner, that's okay too." Avery looked down at her hands, her thoughts swirling. "You're an unusual man, Michael Donovan." He smiled faintly. "I'll take that as a compliment." As the evening unfolded, Avery found herself relaxing. Michael was surprisingly easy to talk to, his sharp business edge softening into something more human. He told her about his father, a mechanic who had dreamed of building a better life for his family. She shared stories about Marcus, how he loved space and dreamed of becoming an astronaut. "I think he'd like you," Avery said, swirling her glass of water absently. Michael leaned forward. "I'd like to meet him someday, if you'd let me." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. "We'll see," she said, deflecting, though the thought lingered. By the time dessert arrived, a shared tiramisu, Avery felt the walls she'd carefully built around herself begin to crack. Michael wasn't the arrogant billionaire she'd expected. He was thoughtful, attentive, and, dare she admit it, kind. But as they stepped back into the cool night air, the reality of their differences came rushing back. His world was money and power, hers was scraped-together paychecks and endless responsibility. "I had a nice time," Avery said as they reached her building. "So did I," Michael replied, his hands in his pockets. For a moment, neither of them moved. The air between them felt heavy with unspoken words. Michael broke the silence first. "Avery, I don't want to complicate your life, but I'd like to see you again." Avery hesitated, her heart tugging in two directions. She wanted to say yes, to let herself feel something outside of survival, but she couldn't ignore the voice in her head warning her to be careful. "I don't know, Michael," she said finally, her voice quiet. "Our lives are so different. I have my son to think about." "I understand," Michael said, though his expression tightened. "But if you ever change your mind, you know where to find me." She nodded, then turned and disappeared into the building. Michael stood on the sidewalk for a long time, staring at the door she'd just walked through. For the first time in years, he felt a pang of vulnerability, an emotion he wasn't used to confronting. As he walked back to his car, a plan began to form in his mind. He wasn't going to give up, not yet. Sometimes the things that mattered most were worth waiting for. The following days felt like a tug of war in Avery's mind. Each time she thought of Michael Donovan, his thoughtful eyes, the way he'd listened so intently as she talked about Marcus, she felt a flutter in her chest that she didn't want to acknowledge. It wasn't just that he'd taken her to dinner or treated her like she mattered. It was the way he seemed genuinely interested in her world, as foreign to him as it might be. But the other voice in her head, the one hardened by years of struggle, was louder. This can't work. People like him don't understand lives like ours. She was at the free clinic, finishing her shift, when her phone buzzed. She glanced down to see a text from Marcus's school. Mrs. Anderson. Marcus got into a little scuffle at recess. Nothing serious, but he was upset. We'll discuss at pickup. Avery sighed, tucking her phone back into her pocket. She couldn't remember the last time Marcus had been in trouble at school. Her heart clenched at the thought of him sitting in class, upset about something he couldn't articulate. As the clinic doors closed behind her, she felt the exhaustion of the day settle in. The bright Oakland sun offered little comfort as she walked the familiar streets toward the school. Michael's office overlooked the San Francisco Bay, a view he usually found grounding. But today, the expanse of water only reminded him of distance, between him and the people he was supposed to lead, between him and the woman he couldn't stop thinking about. Trevor, push the meeting to tomorrow, he said into his intercom. Michael, you've already postponed twice, Trevor's voice replied, tight with frustration. I'm aware. Reschedule. He ended the call before Trevor could argue, running a hand through his hair. He knew his decisions were raising eyebrows. His focus had been razor-sharp for years, but lately it felt like something had shifted. No, not something. Someone. Michael reached for his phone. He hesitated for a moment, then sent a message. Michael, I hope your week's been good. If you need a break, let me know. I'd love to see you again. He stared at the screen, waiting. But no response came. By the time Avery reached Marcus's school, she was wound tight with worry. Mrs. Anderson, his teacher, greeted her in the hallway. It wasn't a big fight, Mrs. Anderson said gently, but Marcus seemed upset. When I asked him what happened, he said another student teased him about... She hesitated. About what? Avery pressed. Mrs. Anderson's expression softened. About your family. Apparently the other student heard something about you being seen with a rich man. Marcus felt like he needed to defend you. Avery's stomach sank. How had word about her and Michael reached Marcus's school? She worked so hard to keep her personal life private, to shield Marcus from anything that might make him feel different. Now, somehow, her connection to Michael was creating waves in a world she'd fought to protect. Thank you for letting me know, Avery said, forcing a tight smile. She found Marcus in the library, his small frame hunched over a book. His face lit up when he saw her, but his smile quickly faded. Am I in trouble? He asked quietly. Avery knelt beside him. No, sweetheart, but I heard you had a tough day. Want to tell me what happened? Marcus hesitated, looking down at his hands. Benny said you're going to leave me. Avery's heart clenched. What? Why would you think that? Because he said rich people don't stay with people like us. He said you're going to go live in a big house with Mr. Michael and forget about me. Tears stung her eyes as she pulled him into a hug. Marcus, listen to me. No one, not Benny, not anyone, gets to decide what our life looks like. And I would never, ever leave you. You're my whole world. He clung to her tightly, his little voice muffled against her shoulder. Promise? Promise, she whispered, kissing his temple. Later that evening, after Marcus had gone to bed, Avery sat on her couch replaying the day in her mind. She wanted to be angry at Michael for disrupting their carefully balanced life, but deep down, she knew it wasn't his fault. Her phone buzzed, breaking her train of thought. It was his message from earlier. Avery stared at the screen for a long moment before typing a response. Avery, my week's been eventful. How's yours? The reply came almost instantly. Michael, better now. Would you let me take you and Marcus somewhere this weekend? Something fun, no pressure. She hesitated. The idea of letting Marcus spend time with Michael felt risky, but she couldn't ignore how much Marcus had been asking about him, or how much she wanted to see him herself. Avery, maybe, Let me think about it. Michael, take your time. Just let me know. Good night, Avery. She set the phone down, her emotions a tangled mix of hope and fear. Michael's sincerity was hard to ignore, but so were the challenges that came with letting him into her life. For the first time, though, she allowed herself to wonder, what if? What if Michael could be more than a complication? What if he could be something more? The Saturday sun hung low in the sky as Avery tightened the straps of Marcus's backpack, adjusting it over his small shoulders. He practically buzzed with excitement, hopping from one foot to the other. "Do you think Mr. Michael has a spaceship?" Marcus asked, his voice laced with anticipation. Avery laughed softly, smoothing down his curls. "I don't think he has a spaceship, sweetheart, but I'm sure whatever he planned will be fun." She wasn't sure why she'd agreed to Michael's offer. Maybe it was Marcus's excitement, or the way Michael's quiet sincerity lingered in her mind long after their last text exchange. Either way, she told herself this outing was for Marcus. Nothing more. When Michael pulled up in a sleek black SUV, Marcus's jaw dropped. Avery gave him a quick nudge. "Close your mouth before a fly gets in," she teased, earning a giggle. Michael stepped out of the car, looking effortlessly casual in dark jeans and a crisp white shirt. He smiled as Marcus ran up to him, already full of questions. "Do you have a spaceship?" Marcus blurted out, his eyes wide. Michael crouched to Marcus's level, his smile widening. "Not yet. But I thought we could visit something close. How do you feel about a science museum?" Marcus let out a gasp of excitement. "Yes, yes, yes, yes." Avery watched the exchange with a mix of amusement and trepidation. Michael's ease with Marcus was disarming, and it made her feel things she wasn't sure she was ready to acknowledge. The museum was a hit from the moment they walked through the doors. Marcus darted from exhibit to exhibit, his excitement palpable as he explored displays about space, dinosaurs, and technology. Michael stayed close, answering Marcus's endless stream of questions with patience and genuine interest. "Did you know astronauts train underwater to practice for zero gravity?" Michael said as Marcus stared at a replica of a space shuttle cockpit. "Whoa," Marcus said, looking up at Michael like he was the coolest person in the world. "How do you know so much?" Michael chuckled. "I read a lot of books when I was your age. I wanted to be an astronaut, too." Avery stood a few steps away, watching them. Marcus's face lit up with every answer Michael gave, and her heart ached with a mix of joy and hesitation. This was the first time in a long while that Marcus had connected with someone like this, and that scared her. "Hey," Michael said softly, stepping beside her as Marcus ran ahead to an interactive display. "You okay?" Avery nodded, crossing her arms. "He's having a great time." "That's not what I asked." She hesitated, then sighed. "I'm just trying to figure out what this is. For him, for me, for us." Michael's expression softened. "I get it, and I don't want to rush you. But I meant what I said before. I'm not here to complicate your life, Avery. I'm here because I want to be." His words were simple, but they carried a weight that settled deep in her chest. After the museum, Michael suggested dinner at a nearby pizza place. Marcus practically bounced in his seat as he built his custom pizza, piling on every topping he could think of. "You sure about all those olives?" Michael asked with a grin, raising an eyebrow. Marcus nodded enthusiastically. "Olives are awesome." Avery shook her head, laughing. "You're going to have to eat all that, you know." "I will," Marcus declared confidently. As they ate, the conversation flowed easily. Michael asked Marcus about school, his favorite superheroes, and his dreams of becoming an astronaut. Avery found herself relaxing, laughing at Marcus's stories and Michael's playful banter. For a moment, it felt normal. Easy. By the time they arrived back at Avery's apartment, Marcus was half asleep in the back seat, his head resting against the window. Michael helped carry him upstairs, careful not to wake him as he gently placed him on his bed. "He's a great kid," Michael said quietly as they stepped back into the living room. Avery smiled. "He is. He's my whole world." Michael looked at her, his gaze steady. "I can see that. And I don't take it lightly, Avery. You've built something beautiful here, something worth protecting." Her heart thudded painfully at his words. "Michael, I know you're scared," he said, his voice low and calm. "I can't pretend to know what it's like to carry the weight you do every day, but I don't want to take anything from you. I just want to be part of it." The vulnerability in his eyes was almost too much. Avery looked away, wrapping her arms around herself. "You don't know what you're asking for," she whispered. "Maybe not," he admitted, "but I know I want to try." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the air between them heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Avery let out a shaky breath. "One step at a time. That's all I can give you." Michael nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "That's more than enough." As he left, Avery leaned against the door, her emotions a tangled mix of hope, fear, and something she hadn't felt in years. Possibility. The crisp autumn air wrapped around Avery as she walked Marcus to school the next morning. He chattered beside her, recounting every detail of the previous day. How Michael had known so much about space, how cool the museum exhibits were, and how the pizza they'd shared had been the best ever. "Do you think we'll see him again, Mom?" Marcus asked, his hopeful eyes peeking out from beneath his hoodie. Avery hesitated, gripping his small hand tighter as they crossed the street. "Maybe," she said, her voice careful. "We'll see." Marcus grinned, satisfied with her answer, and bounded ahead toward the school gate, leaving Avery standing alone on the sidewalk. She watched him join his friends, the weight of his question lingering in her chest. At the clinic later that morning, Avery was distracted. She moved through her tasks mechanically, her mind replaying the events of the past few days. Michael's words echoed in her mind. "I just want to be part of it." The sincerity in his voice had been impossible to ignore, and yet she couldn't shake her unease. Her life was complicated enough without adding a man like Michael Donovan into the mix. He might mean well, but his world was light years away from hers. How could he possibly understand the challenges she faced every day? Balancing bills, raising Marcus, building a future on a shoestring budget. But then she thought about the way Marcus had looked at Michael, the pure joy in his laughter as they'd explored the museum together. For all her doubts, she couldn't deny that Michael had brought something into their lives she hadn't seen in years. Ease. That evening, as she walked home, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced at the screen to see a text from Michael. "Michael, how are you?" She stopped in her tracks, staring at the message. 3 simple words, but they carried a weight she wasn't sure she was ready to bear. After a moment's hesitation, she replied, "Avery. Tired, but okay. How about you?" His response came quickly. "Michael. Same. Long day at work. I've been thinking about you." Her breath caught in her chest. Before she could overthink it, she typed back, "Avery. What about me?" There was a pause, long enough for her to wonder if she'd said too much, before his reply appeared. "Michael. Everything. How you're doing. What you're thinking. What I can do to make your life easier." Avery leaned against a lamppost, her fingers trembling slightly as she typed her response. "Avery. I don't need you to make my life easier, Michael." His reply came almost instantly. "Michael. I know. But that doesn't mean I don't want to." She stared at the words, her heart hammering in her chest. This was dangerous territory, and she knew it. But there was something about Michael's persistence, his quiet determination, that made her want to believe him. After a long moment, she replied, "Avery, I don't know if I can do this." "Michael, you don't have to decide right now. Just don't shut me out." Avery exhaled slowly, her grip on the phone tightening. She didn't reply, but she didn't delete the message either. Instead, she slid the phone back into her pocket and continued walking, the weight of their exchange following her all the way home. The next week passed in a blur of work and routine. Avery kept busy, focusing on Marcus and her classes, trying to ignore the growing knot of uncertainty in her chest. Michael texted her every few days, short, thoughtful messages that didn't demand anything but still made her pause. Then one evening he called. She hesitated before answering, her thumb hovering over the screen. Finally, she pressed the button and held the phone to her ear. "Hi," she said, her voice tentative. "Hi," Michael replied, his tone warm and steady. "I didn't mean to bother you. I just wanted to hear your voice." Her heart softened despite herself. "You're not bothering me." There was a brief silence. Then Michael said, "I was wondering if you and Marcus would like to join me for a charity event this weekend. It's at the community center downtown, a fundraiser for after-school programs." Avery frowned, her initial reaction one of hesitation. "Michael, I'm not sure that's a good idea." "Before you say no," he interrupted gently, "I promise it's not some big fancy gala. It's casual, kid-friendly, and it's for a good cause." She bit her lip, conflicted. The thought of stepping into Michael's world again made her uneasy, but the mention of the community center gave her pause. She'd volunteered there years ago when Marcus was just a toddler, and she knew how important their programs were for kids in the neighborhood. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "That's all I'm asking," Michael said, his voice laced with relief. "Just think about it." That Saturday, Avery stood in front of her closet debating whether or not to go. The thought of seeing Michael again, of letting Marcus spend more time with him, made her stomach churn with equal parts anxiety and anticipation. But the thought of missing out on an opportunity to support the community center tugged at her just as strongly. In the end, it was Marcus who made the decision. "Are we going, Mom?" he asked, his big brown eyes filled with excitement. "I want to see Mr. Michael again." Avery sighed, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "Yes, baby, we're going." Marcus cheered, and Avery couldn't help but smile, even as the knot in her chest tightened. She told herself this was about supporting the community center, about giving Marcus a chance to enjoy himself. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. Michael Donovan had stepped into their lives unexpectedly, and no matter how much she tried to resist, he was beginning to leave his mark. The community center buzzed with energy when Avery and Marcus arrived. The warm scent of baked goods mingled with the distant laughter of children playing games in the courtyard. Tables were set up with colorful decorations, and volunteers moved between booths, smiling and chatting with visitors. For a moment, Avery felt a sense of familiarity, a reminder of the years she had spent here when Marcus was younger. "Whoa, this place is awesome," Marcus exclaimed, tugging on her hand as his eyes darted to the activity booths. "Can I go play, Mom?" Avery smiled at his enthusiasm. "Go ahead, but stay where I can see you." Marcus was off in a flash, heading toward a booth where kids were building birdhouses. Avery lingered at the entrance, taking in the lively scene. She spotted Michael near the center of the courtyard, talking to a group of volunteers. He looked effortless as usual, dressed in a simple navy sweater and dark jeans, but there was something softer about him in this setting. Before she could change her mind, Michael turned and saw her. A warm smile spread across his face as he excused himself from the conversation and walked over. "You made it," he said. his tone carrying a mix of relief and happiness. Avery shrugged, trying to appear casual even as her pulse quickened. "It's for a good cause." Michael chuckled. "And here I thought it was my charming invitation." "Don't push your luck," she said with a smirk, but the lightness in her voice surprised even her. He glanced toward Marcus, who was now engrossed in painting his birdhouse, his tongue poking out in concentration. "Looks like he's already having a great time." "He's been talking about this all week," Avery admitted. "I think you've made quite the impression." Michael's smile softened. "He's an incredible kid. You've done an amazing job with him." Avery's defenses faltered at the sincerity in his voice. "Thanks," she said quietly, her gaze dropping for a moment before meeting his again. "It hasn't been easy." "I can tell," Michael said, his expression thoughtful. "But the way you've built this life for him, it's inspiring, Avery." She opened her mouth to respond, but was interrupted by a cheerful voice behind them. "Michael, there you are." Avery turned to see a tall woman in a chic blazer and heels striding toward them. She was striking, her confidence radiating as she approached. The smile she directed at Michael was polished and possessive, and Avery immediately felt a prickle of discomfort. "Victoria," Michael said, his tone polite but cool. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Well, I couldn't miss such an important event," Victoria replied, her eyes flicking to Avery with a cursory glance before returning to Michael. "I thought we could catch up." Michael's jaw tightened slightly. "This isn't really the time." Victoria's smile didn't falter, but her eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "Of course, but maybe later?" Avery shifted awkwardly, feeling like an outsider in a conversation she didn't belong in. Michael seemed to sense her discomfort and turned back to her. "Avery, this is Victoria Ellis. She's—" He paused as if searching for the right words. "An old acquaintance." Victoria's perfectly arched brow lifted at the description, but she offered her hand with a tight smile. "Charmed." Avery shook her hand, sensing the unspoken tension in the air. "Nice to meet you." "And you are?" Victoria asked, her tone dripping with polite curiosity. "Avery Johnson," she said simply, refusing to elaborate. Victoria's gaze lingered on her for a moment, as if sizing her up, before she turned her attention back to Michael. "I'll let you get back to it. But don't forget, dinner next week." With that, she disappeared into the crowd. Avery looked at Michael, one brow raised. "Dinner next week?" Michael exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's not what it sounds like. Victoria's persistent." "Clearly," Avery said, crossing her arms. "She seemed nice." "She's not," Michael said quickly, then winced. "I mean, she's not exactly easy." Avery couldn't help but laugh at his obvious discomfort. "Relax, Michael. You don't owe me an explanation." Michael frowned, stepping closer. "Maybe not, but I want to be honest with you. Victoria and I dated a few years ago. It ended for a reason, and I haven't looked back since. She doesn't handle rejection well, and I think she's hoping I'll change my mind." Avery studied him, searching for any sign of insincerity. She found none. "Fair enough," she said finally, "but you might want to clarify that with her before she starts planning a wedding." Michael chuckled, some of the tension easing from his shoulders. "You're probably right." Before Avery could respond, Marcus came bounding up to them, holding his freshly painted birdhouse. "Mom, look what I made," he said, holding it up proudly. "That's amazing, baby," Avery said, her smile genuine. "You did such a good job." Michael crouched to examine it, his face lighting up. "That's awesome, Marcus. You've got a real talent for this." Marcus beamed, clearly thrilled by the praise. "Do you think I can hang it outside our window?" "Absolutely," Avery said, ruffling his hair. As Marcus ran off to join another activity, Michael straightened, his gaze returning to Avery. I'm glad you came today." She shrugged, trying to downplay the warmth in his voice. "Marcus had fun. That's what matters." Michael nodded, but his eyes held hers for a moment longer. "It's more than that, Avery. At least it is for me." Her breath caught, the sincerity in his words threatening to unravel the careful walls she'd built. Before she could respond, Marcus called out to her, waving from across the courtyard. "I should go check on him," she said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. Michael nodded, stepping back. "Of course. But I hope this isn't the last time I see you." Avery turned away, her heart pounding as she walked toward Marcus. She told herself she was doing the right thing, keeping her distance, protecting her world from any unnecessary complications. But deep down, a small, quiet part of her wondered if she was only running from something she couldn't ignore. Avery sat at her kitchen table that evening, the hum of the apartment's old refrigerator filling the silence as she stared at the unopened textbook in front of her. Marcus was asleep in his room, his newly painted birdhouse already hung proudly outside their window. She had planned to use the quiet time to study, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the day's events, and to Michael. Victoria's sudden appearance had thrown her off balance, though she didn't want to admit it. There had been something unsettling about the woman's confidence, the way she had dismissed Avery without a second thought. It was a stark reminder of the world Michael came from, a world where women like Victoria felt at home and women like Avery didn't exist. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. Michael's name lit up the screen. For a moment she debated letting it go to voicemail, but curiosity won out. She answered, her voice steady. "Michael." "Hey," he said, his tone warm but cautious. "I wasn't sure if you'd pick up." "I almost didn't," she admitted, leaning back in her chair. "What's up?" "I just wanted to check on you. Today was a lot." Avery let out a soft laugh, her tension easing slightly. "That's one way to put it." "I didn't mean for things to get complicated," Michael said, his voice sincere. "Victoria showing up wasn't planned." "I figured as much," Avery replied. "But Michael, she's a reminder of what I've been trying to tell you. Your world and mine, they don't mix." Michael was silent for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter. "I don't see it that way. Maybe you don't, but she does, and I'm sure there are others who feel the same." "I don't care what she thinks," he said firmly. "Or anyone else for that matter. Avery, I know this isn't easy for you, but I also know what I want, and I think you do too." Avery's breath caught at his words, the vulnerability in his voice cutting through her defenses. She wanted to believe him, to let herself imagine what it might be like to let him in. But the weight of her reality, the bills, the long hours, the constant balancing act, pulled her back to the ground. "Michael," she said softly, "it's not that simple." "Maybe not," he replied. "But doesn't that make it worth it?" Avery closed her eyes, her heart and head warring within her. "I need time," she said finally. "You've got it," Michael said without hesitation. "I'm not going anywhere." His words hung in the air long after the call ended, leaving Avery with a strange mix of hope and fear. The next morning, Michael stood in his office staring out at the city skyline as Trevor entered. His business partner's usual air of calm confidence was tempered by a hint of irritation. "You've been distracted lately," Trevor said, dropping a folder onto Michael's desk. "The board's starting to notice." Michael turned, his expression cool. "What are you getting at?" "I'm saying that whatever it is you're doing with Avery Johnson, it's affecting your judgment. You're making decisions based on emotions, not strategy." Michael's jaw tightened. "Avery has nothing to do with my ability to run this company." Trevor raised an eyebrow. "Doesn't she?" "Because the Michael I know wouldn't have delayed the Delgado deal twice. He wouldn't be spending his weekends at community fundraisers instead of securing our next big contract. Michael's fists clenched at his sides. Those delays have nothing to do with Avery, and last I checked, the fundraiser didn't bankrupt us. Not yet, Trevor shot back. But you're walking a fine line, Michael. People are watching, and they don't like what they see. Michael stepped closer, his voice low and steady. I don't care what they like. This company was built on my vision, my decisions. If anyone has a problem with that, they're welcome to walk. Trevor studied him for a long moment, then sighed. You're not the same, you know. What's that supposed to mean? I mean this woman. It's obvious she's changing you, and I'm not sure that's a good thing. Michael's eyes darkened. Maybe that's exactly what I need. Across town, Avery was finishing her shift at the clinic when Gloria Simmons, her retired nurse mentor, stopped by for a visit. Gloria was a no-nonsense woman with a sharp wit and a heart of gold, and Avery had always valued her advice. What's got you looking like you've seen a ghost? Gloria asked, settling into a chair in the break room. Avery sighed, sinking into the seat across from her. It's complicated. Men always are, Gloria said with a smirk. Now spill. Avery hesitated, then told her about Michael, how they'd met, how he'd connected with Marcus, and the tug of war she felt every time she thought about him. Gloria listened intently, her expression thoughtful. When Avery finished, she leaned back, her arms crossed. Sounds to me like he's trying, honey. The question is, are you? Avery frowned. What do you mean? I mean you've got this man chasing after you, trying to be part of your life, and you're over here looking for reasons to push him away. The real question is why. Avery looked down at her hands, Gloria's words hitting too close to home. Because it's easier, she admitted quietly. Because if I don't let him in, I don't have to worry about losing him. Gloria leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. Baby, life isn't about easy. It's about what's worth it. And it sounds like this man sees something in you that you've forgotten to see in yourself. Avery swallowed hard, Gloria's words settling deep in her chest. Maybe Michael wasn't the problem. Maybe she was. As the day turned to night, Avery sat on her couch, staring at the phone in her hand. Her thumb hovered over Michael's number, her heart pounding. Before she could second-guess herself, she pressed call. Michael was in his study when his phone buzzed on the desk beside him. He glanced at the screen and froze. Avery Johnson calling. For a split second he hesitated, unsure what to expect. Then he picked up. Avery, he said, his voice betraying the hope that surged through him. There was a beat of silence on the other end, and then her voice came, soft but resolute. Hey, Michael, I've been thinking. He leaned back in his chair, gripping the phone tighter. That's usually a good sign. She let out a quiet laugh, the sound tugging at something deep in his chest. I've been overthinking everything, pushing you away because it felt safer. But Gloria, my mentor, she made me realize that maybe I'm the one making things harder than they need to be. Michael straightened, her words breaking through the tension he hadn't realized he'd been holding all day. I can understand why you'd feel that way, he said carefully. But I don't want to make your life harder, Avery. I want to make it better, if you'll let me. She sighed, the sound full of the weight she was carrying. That's the thing, Michael. I don't know how to let someone help me. I've been on my own for so long, I've forgotten what it feels like to lean on someone. I'm not asking you to change who you are, he said gently. I love that you're strong and independent, but you don't have to do everything alone, Avery. I want to stand beside you, not in front of you. Her silence felt charged, as if she were grappling with his words. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. I think I want to try. I just don't know how to trust that this is real. Michael's chest tightened, her vulnerability cutting through him. Then let me prove it to you. One step at a time, like you said. Okay, she said finally. One step at a time. The following weekend, Michael invited Avery and Marcus to his penthouse for dinner. Avery felt a knot of anxiety as she stepped out of the elevator and into the sleek, expansive space that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the glittering San Francisco skyline. Whoa, Marcus said, his voice full of awe as he took in the towering windows and minimalist design. Your house is like a spaceship. Michael chuckled, walking over to greet them. That's a first, but I'll take it as a compliment. Marcus ran ahead to explore the living room, leaving Avery standing by the entrance, clutching her bag. Michael's gaze softened as he noticed her hesitation. You okay? He asked. She nodded, forcing a small smile. Just a little out of my element. Good, he said with a grin, stepping closer. That makes two of us. Avery's smile grew, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. I doubt that. I mean it, he said, his voice earnest. I've never done this before, Avery. Not like this. Before she could respond, Marcus came bounding back, holding a remote. Can I fly the spaceship? He asked, pointing to the enormous TV mounted on the wall. Michael laughed. Go for it. But don't blame me if it crashes. As Marcus settled in with a video game Michael had set up, Avery followed him into the open kitchen. The sleek counters gleamed under the soft lighting, and the aroma of roasted vegetables and garlic filled the air. You cooked? She asked, raising an eyebrow. Technically, yes, Michael said, looking sheepish, with a lot of help from a very patient chef. Avery laughed, the sound light and genuine. At least you're honest. They moved around the kitchen with surprising ease, Michael pouring her a glass of wine as they chatted about their weeks. The intimacy of the moment caught Avery off guard. How natural it felt to be here, to share this space with him. As they sat down to dinner, Marcus entertained them with stories from school, his excitement infectious. Avery watched as Michael engaged with her son, asking thoughtful questions and laughing at his jokes. It was a side of Michael she hadn't expected. A man who wasn't just charming and confident, but also kind and deeply invested in the people around him. After dinner, as Marcus curled up on the couch with a blanket, engrossed in a movie Michael had queued up, Avery and Michael retreated to the balcony. The city stretched out before them, a sea of lights shimmering against the dark sky. It's beautiful, Avery said, leaning against the railing. It is, Michael replied, his eyes on her instead of the view. She turned to him, catching his gaze. Thank you for tonight. Marcus had an amazing time. I'm glad, he said softly. But what about you? Avery hesitated, her guard slipping further than she intended. I did too, more than I expected. Michael stepped closer, the warmth of his presence both calming and electrifying. Avery, I meant what I said. I'm not in this for the short term. I want to be here, for you, for Marcus. I know it's not going to be easy, but I don't care. She looked at him, her heart pounding. You make it sound so simple. It's not, he admitted. But the best things never are. For the first time, Avery allowed herself to believe him, to let the hope she'd been holding back rise to the surface. One step at a time, she whispered. Michael smiled, his hand brushing hers. One step at a time. As they stood on the balcony, the city alive around them, Avery felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, the quiet, steady certainty that she didn't have to face everything alone. For now, that was enough. Avery adjusted the strap of her bag as she walked out of the clinic into the cool evening air. It had been a long day, filled with back-to-back shifts and barely a moment to breathe. Normally she'd head straight home, eager to see Marcus and unwind, but tonight felt different. Her thoughts were consumed with Michael, his words, his presence, the way he had seamlessly begun to fit into her life. As she waited for the bus, her phone buzzed. She didn't need to check the screen to know who it was. Michael had been texting her every day, nothing overwhelming, just small messages to check in or share something that made him think of her. She appreciated his thoughtfulness, even if it scared her how much she was starting to look forward to hearing from him. "Michael, busy day?" She smiled, her fingers moving across the screen before she could second-guess herself. "Avery, always." "You?" The reply came almost instantly. "Michael, busy but not too busy to wonder how you're doing." Avery rolled her eyes, though a small smile tugged at her lips. Before she could respond, the bus arrived, and she tucked her phone away, climbing aboard. The ride home was uneventful, but the quiet gave her time to reflect. She had let Michael in more than she ever intended. And though a part of her still braced for the other shoe to drop, another part, a quieter, hopeful part, wanted to believe he could be different. Meanwhile, across town, Michael sat in his office, his phone in hand and his mind far from the spreadsheets and contracts spread out on his desk. His assistant, Janet, knocked softly before stepping inside. "Long day?" she asked, noting the tension in his posture. "Something like that," Michael replied, setting his phone down. Janet gave him a knowing look. "This wouldn't have anything to do with a certain Avery Johnson, would it?" Michael raised an eyebrow. "You're awfully perceptive." "It's my job," she said with a smirk. "But also you've been different lately. Happier, maybe. More distracted, definitely." Michael leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "She's special. And I don't mean that lightly. She makes me question things I thought I knew about myself, my life." Janet nodded, her expression softening. "That's a good thing, Michael. But you have to be ready for the pushback, not just from her world, but from yours." He sighed, knowing she was right. The world he'd built didn't leave much room for vulnerability or emotional risks. And yet, with Avery, he was willing to face whatever came next. A few nights later, Michael invited Avery and Marcus to a company event at a high-end rooftop venue downtown. The event was supposed to be a casual networking mixer, but Avery felt anything but casual as she stood in front of her closet, staring at her limited wardrobe. "Mom, do you need help?" Marcus asked, leaning against the doorframe, his small face full of curiosity. Avery sighed, glancing at him. "I think I might." Marcus grinned and pointed to a simple black dress she hadn't worn in years. "That one. You look pretty in it." Avery smiled, ruffling his hair. "You think so?" "Yep. Mr. Michael's going to think so too," Marcus said with the blunt honesty only a child could muster. Avery laughed, though her heart fluttered at the thought. She dressed quickly, pulling her curls into a neat bun and applying just a hint of makeup. When she and Marcus arrived at the venue, her nerves were in full swing. The rooftop sparkled with fairy lights, and the city skyline provided a stunning backdrop. Waiters moved through the crowd with trays of hors d'oeuvres, and soft jazz played in the background. Avery felt out of place, her modest dress and sensible shoes a stark contrast to the designer gowns and tailored suits surrounding her. Michael spotted them immediately, his face lighting up as he approached. "You made it," he said, his gaze softening as it landed on Avery. "We did," she said, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "And you look beautiful," he added, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Avery blushed, but before she could respond, Marcus tugged on Michael's sleeve. "Mr. Michael, is this your spaceship?" Michael grinned, crouching to Marcus's level. "Not quite, but I'd say it's close. What do you think?" Marcus's eyes widened as he took in the view. It's so cool. As Marcus ran off to explore under the watchful eye of one of Michael's assistants, Avery and Michael moved to the edge of the rooftop where the view of the city was breathtaking. "I'm glad you came," Michael said, his voice warm. "I wasn't sure if I would," Avery admitted, her gaze sweeping over the skyline. "This isn't exactly my world." "It could be," Michael said gently, his eyes searching hers. "If you let it." Avery turned to him, her defenses slipping. "Michael, I've spent my whole life making sure Marcus has stability. I've worked so hard to build a life where we don't have to rely on anyone else. Letting someone in, it's terrifying." "I get that," he said softly. "But you don't have to do it alone anymore, Avery. I'm here. For you. For Marcus. And I'm not going anywhere." Her chest tightened at his words, the sincerity in his voice breaking through the walls she'd built around her heart. "You make it sound so easy." "It's not," Michael said, stepping closer. "But the best things never are." For a moment the noise of the party faded into the background, and all Avery could see was him, his steady gaze, his quiet strength. She wanted to believe him, to let herself trust that this could be something real. "One step at a time," she whispered, echoing the promise they'd made to each other. Michael smiled, his hand brushing hers. One step at a time. Avery woke the morning after the rooftop event with a strange sense of calm and unease colliding within her. The night had been magical, filled with moments that felt almost too good to be true. Yet as she looked around her modest apartment, the weight of reality settled in. She had caught glimpses of the way people at the event looked at her, curious, appraising, and in some cases, outright dismissive. It wasn't anything they said directly. It was in the sidelong glances and the forced politeness that made her stomach churn. She had spent most of her life blending into the background, working hard to ensure Marcus had everything he needed. Now, stepping into Michael's world felt like standing in a spotlight she hadn't asked for. Marcus bounded into the kitchen, his energy undeterred. "Mom, did you see the pictures I drew of the spaceship?" She smiled, grateful for the distraction. "I didn't. Show me." He pulled out a few sheets of paper filled with crayon drawings of towering buildings with glowing windows. "This is like Mr. Michael's house, and this one is the spaceship he promised me we'd build." Avery laughed softly. "He promised you a spaceship?" "Well, not really, but he said we could pretend." Her heart softened. Michael had a way of meeting Marcus on his level, of making him feel seen. It was one of the things that scared her the most, how quickly Marcus had latched onto him. What if this didn't last? What if Michael's world became too much and he walked away? She couldn't risk Marcus getting hurt, or herself. Across the bay, Michael sat in his office, his phone buzzing with notifications he ignored. The Delgado deal was back on the table, with Trevor pressuring him to finalize the terms, but Michael's focus was elsewhere. He scrolled through the pictures he'd taken at the event, Marcus holding his birdhouse, Avery smiling shyly at the edge of the rooftop. "She's under your skin, isn't she?" Trevor's voice broke the silence as he stepped into the office uninvited. Michael looked up, his jaw tightening. "You don't have to make it sound like a bad thing." Trevor folded his arms, his expression wary. "It's not bad. It's just complicated. I've known you a long time, Michael. You've always kept people at arm's length, and now, all of a sudden, you're pulling someone in, someone who doesn't fit into the world you've built." Michael's gaze hardened. "Maybe that world isn't what I want anymore." Trevor raised an eyebrow. "You're willing to risk everything you've built for her?" Michael leaned back in his chair, his voice steady. "It's not a risk. It's a choice. And it's mine to make." Trevor sighed, shaking his head. "Just be careful, Michael. People are watching. and not everyone's rooting for you. That evening, Michael called Avery. She answered after a few rings, her voice warm but cautious. "Hey," she said. "Hey," he replied, leaning against his kitchen counter. "I've been thinking about you." She laughed softly, the sound sending a jolt of warmth through him. "You say that a lot." "Because it's true," he said simply. "How are you feeling after last night?" Avery hesitated. It was a lot to take in. Everyone was so polished, so different. "You weren't," Michael said, his voice firm. "You were yourself, and that's why you stood out." "I don't know if that's a good thing," she admitted quietly. "I felt like I didn't belong." "You belonged," he said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "More than half the people in that room." There was a pause before she asked, "How do you do it? Fit into that world so easily?" "I don't," Michael said, surprising even himself with the admission. "I used to think I did, but now, I don't know. It feels hollow, like I've spent years chasing things that don't really matter." Avery's voice softened. "And now?" "Now I'm trying to figure out what does." The line went quiet for a moment before she said, "You make it sound so simple." "It's not," he admitted, "but nothing worth having ever is." The next day, Avery was at the clinic when she saw Gloria waiting in the lobby, her expression as sharp as ever. Gloria had a way of showing up when Avery least expected it, but always seemed to need her the most. "Don't mind me," Gloria said as Avery walked over. "I'm just here to make sure you're not overthinking yourself into a hole." Avery smiled despite herself. "I'm fine. Are you?" Gloria raised an eyebrow. "Because you've got that look, the one that says you're 2 seconds away from talking yourself out of something good." Avery sighed, sinking into the chair beside her. "It's just a lot. Michael's world, his people, I don't fit in there, Gloria." "Maybe you don't," Gloria said bluntly. "But has it occurred to you that he doesn't care?" Avery hesitated. "What if I mess this up? What if it all falls apart?" Gloria placed a hand on her shoulder, her voice gentle. "Baby, life's messy. Love's messier. But if you spend all your time worrying about what could go wrong, you'll miss out on what could go right." Avery swallowed hard, her eyes stinging. "It's not just about me. I have to think about Marcus." "And do you really think that man would hurt him?" Gloria asked. "From what you've told me, he's done nothing but show up for both of you. Don't let fear make the decision for you, Avery." That night, as Avery tucked Marcus into bed, she thought about Gloria's words. Michael had done nothing but prove himself, time and again. Maybe it was time to let herself believe that he wasn't going anywhere. After Marcus fell asleep, she picked up her phone and sent Michael a message. "Avery. 1 step at a time, right?" The reply came almost instantly. "Michael. Always." Avery stood in the kitchen, flipping pancakes as the morning sunlight streamed through the window. Marcus sat at the table, doodling on a piece of paper, his excitement bubbling over from a conversation they'd had the EY. "Do you think Mr. Michael will be here on time?" Marcus asked, looking up from his drawing. "I'm sure he will," Avery replied, her voice even, though her nerves told a different story. Michael had offered to take them out for a day trip to the coast, a chance to step out of their usual routine and just enjoy each other's company. Marcus was ecstatic. Avery was unsure. Letting Michael into her life had been a slow, cautious process. Letting him into Marcus's world had been even more so, but he had proven himself time and again patient, consistent, and unwavering in his care for both of them. The knock on the door came right on time. Marcus scrambled to answer it, practically pulling Michael inside before Avery could so much as set the spatula down. "Good morning to you, too," Michael said with a laugh as Marcus tugged him toward the living room to show off his latest drawing. Avery wiped her hands on a towel, turning to greet him. "You're early." Michael smiled, his eyes soft as they met hers. "Figured I'd earn some extra points by being punctual." "Points?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Well," he said, stepping closer, "I thought I might need them to convince you that this day's going to be worth it." Avery rolled her eyes, but she couldn't stop the smile that crept onto her face. "We'll see." The drive to the coast was filled with laughter and easy conversation. Michael had rented a car roomy enough for the three of them, and Marcus spent most of the ride pressing his face to the window, marveling at the passing scenery. "Mom, look at the trees. They're so big," Marcus exclaimed as they wound through a forested stretch of the highway. "They're called redwoods," Michael explained, glancing back with a smile. "They're some of the tallest trees in the world." "Do you think we can climb one?" Marcus asked, his eyes wide. "Not today," Avery interjected, laughing. "Let's start with a walk." The coastline came into view just as the sun began to peek through the morning haze, casting a golden glow over the cliffs and sparkling waves. Marcus was out of the car before Avery could unbuckle her seatbelt, running ahead toward the path that led to the beach. "Careful," Avery called after him, her heart racing as she hurried to catch up. Michael walked beside her, his pace easy. "He's got a lot of energy." "Tell me about it," Avery said, shaking her head. "He's been like this since the day he learned to walk." Michael chuckled, then glanced at her. "You've done an amazing job with him, you know." Avery felt her cheeks warm under his gaze. "Thanks. But it's a team effort. I've had a lot of support along the way." "Still," he said, his tone thoughtful, "it's not easy, doing what you've done. Building a life for the two of you, holding it all together." She looked at him, her guard lowering just a bit. "It's not easy, no. But it's worth it." Michael nodded, his expression serious. "And I want to be part of that, Avery. If you'll let me." Her heart skipped a beat at his words, the weight of them settling in her chest. She opened her mouth to respond, but was interrupted by Marcus shouting from ahead. "Mom! Mr. Michael, look at this rock! It's huge!" They both laughed, quickening their pace to join him. The day unfolded like something out of a dream. They explored tide pools, collected shells, and played in the sand, the sound of Marcus's laughter carrying on the breeze. Avery found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in years, the constant weight of responsibility easing, if only for a little while. As the afternoon wore on, they sat on a blanket overlooking the ocean, sharing sandwiches and fruit Michael had packed. Marcus lay sprawled out, staring at the clouds, while Avery and Michael talked quietly. "I've been thinking about what you said," Avery began, her voice careful. "About wanting to be part of our lives." Michael looked at her, his expression steady. "And?" "And I'm scared," she admitted, the words coming out more easily than she expected. "But I also know that I can't keep pushing you away just because it feels safer." Michael reached for her hand, his touch warm and grounding. "You don't have to be scared alone, Avery. I'm here, for you and Marcus. I'm not going anywhere." She met his gaze, the sincerity in his eyes breaking through the last of her defenses. "Okay," she said softly. "One step at a time." Michael smiled, his grip on her hand tightening slightly. "One step at a time." As the sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky with shades of pink and orange, Marcus dozed off in the back seat during the drive home. Avery sat in the passenger seat, watching Michael as he drove, his profile outlined by the fading light. She thought about all the moments that had brought them to this point: the lost suitcase, the first awkward meeting, the tentative steps toward trust. And for the first time she allowed herself to hope that this could be something real, because for all the risks, all the uncertainties, one thing had become clear: Michael wasn't just a complication in her life. He was a possibility, and that was worth holding on to. The soft hum of conversation filled the air as Avery stepped into the community garden, her heels crunching lightly against the gravel path. The evening light bathed the space in a golden glow, illuminating the rows of flowers and greenery that stretched across the urban sanctuary. Strings of twinkling lights hung between trees, casting a warm, magical ambiance over the gathering. Marcus ran ahead, his laughter echoing as he joined a group of children near the makeshift stage at the center. Avery watched him, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and contentment. This event, a celebration of the community programs that Michael had championed, felt like the perfect culmination of everything they had worked toward. And at the heart of it all was him. Michael stood near the stage, dressed in a tailored gray suit that somehow looked both effortless and intentional. He was deep in conversation with a group of community leaders, his posture relaxed yet commanding. Every so often his gaze flicked toward Avery, his smile softening when their eyes met. Avery approached slowly, taking in the scene. She thought back to how far they had come, how much had changed since the day she found that suitcase on the curb. She had been a woman focused solely on survival, wary of anything, or anyone, that might disrupt the fragile stability she'd built for herself and Marcus. And now, she was standing in the middle of a dream she hadn't even known she'd dared to hope for. "Hey, you," Michael said as she reached him, his voice low and warm. He excused himself from the conversation and turned to her fully, his eyes lighting up. "You look stunning." Avery glanced down at the simple blue dress she'd chosen, a far cry from the opulence she'd seen at his other events. But the way Michael looked at her made her feel like she belonged. "Thank you," she said softly. "This is incredible, Michael. You've done something really special here." "We've done something special," he corrected, his gaze steady. "You and Marcus inspired me to think about what actually matters. This community, these programs, they're just the beginning." Avery's chest tightened, his words sinking deep into her heart. "You've changed so much," she said quietly. "The Michael I met months ago was brilliant and successful, but he wasn't this." He smiled, reaching for her hand. "That's because the Michael you met months ago didn't know what he was missing." She looked down at their intertwined fingers, her voice trembling slightly. "And now?" "Now I do," he said, his voice firm yet filled with emotion. "I know that none of this, none of the success, the money, the power, means anything without the people I care about. And I care about you, Avery, you and Marcus." Tears stung her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Instead, she squeezed his hand, her voice steady. "I care about you too, Michael. More than I ever thought I could." A voice crackled over the microphone at the stage, drawing their attention. One of the community leaders was addressing the crowd, thanking everyone for their contributions and highlighting the impact of the programs they were supporting. "Go," Avery whispered, nodding toward the stage. "This is your moment." Michael hesitated, his eyes lingering on her for a moment longer before he leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to her cheek. "This is our moment," he said, before stepping onto the stage. The speech Michael gave was heartfelt and genuine, a reflection of the man he had become. He spoke about the importance of giving back, of using wealth and power to create lasting change. He credited the people who had inspired him, his father, the community leaders, and finally, Avery and Marcus. As the applause rang out, Avery felt a sense of pride she hadn't experienced in years, not just for Michael, but for herself, for letting down her walls, for trusting him, for taking a chance on love and possibility. When the crowd began to disperse, Marcus ran to her, his cheeks flushed with excitement. "Mom, did you see? Mr. Michael was amazing." "I did," she said, pulling him into a hug. "And so were you." Michael joined them moments later, his expression a mix of joy and nervous anticipation. He knelt down to Marcus's level, his voice gentle. "Hey, buddy, can I ask you something?" Marcus nodded eagerly. "How would you feel if I were around more? Like, all the time?" Marcus tilted his head, his brow furrowed. "Like living with us?" Michael chuckled, glancing at Avery before looking back at Marcus. "Something like that." Marcus broke into a grin. "That would be awesome. Can we build the spaceship then?" Michael laughed, pulling him into a hug. "Deal." As Marcus ran off to join the other kids again, Michael stood, turning to Avery. "Well, that's one down." Avery raised an eyebrow. "And the other?" Michael reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. Avery's breath caught as he opened it to reveal a simple, elegant ring. "I know we said one step at a time," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "And I don't want to rush you, but I also know what I want, and it's standing right in front of me. Avery Johnson, will you marry me?" The world seemed to fall away as Avery looked at him, her heart full and steady for the first time in years. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she nodded, her voice breaking. "Yes." Michael slipped the ring onto her finger, his smile brighter than she had ever seen. "One step at a time," he said softly. Avery leaned into him, her arms wrapping around his neck as she whispered, "Always." The night ended with laughter and celebration, a blend of two worlds that had once seemed impossibly far apart. And as Avery stood with Michael and Marcus, watching the stars sparkle above the city, she knew she had made the right choice. Because sometimes, the best things in life weren't the ones you planned for. They were the ones you found when you least expected them.